wasn't trained to protect feelings. He was trained to stop assassins. But when a trembling 10-year-old prince lifted his sleeve, one royal guard realized the palace was no longer safe. Chapter 1. The smile that didn't reach his eyes. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Buckingham Palace. Guard Thomas Hale stood at his post near the east entrance, his scarlet uniform pristine, his face an unreadable mask. 12 years of service had taught him to see everything while appearing to notice nothing. Tourists gathered behind the iron gates, cameras clicking, children pointing, the usual symphony of a summer morning in London. Thomas's eyes swept the courtyard in practiced intervals. 3 seconds left, 3 seconds right, back to center. Nothing out of the ordinary, until he saw him. Prince George was walking toward him from the inner courtyard. Alone. That was the first irregularity. The young prince was never alone. Thomas's training kicked in immediately. Assess the situation, maintain position, prepare for protocol deviation. But as the boy drew closer, Thomas noticed something that made his pulse quicken beneath his stoic exterior. The prince was smiling, yes, but it was wrong. The smile didn't reach his eyes. Those eyes, wide, frightened, darting, belonged to someone being hunted. The prince's hands were shaking. Thomas watched as George tugged at his left sleeve, pulling it down over his wrist with a motion that seemed both deliberate and desperate. The boy glanced over his shoulder twice before reaching Thomas's position. "Good morning, Your Royal Highness," Thomas said, his voice the regulation blend of respect and distance. George stopped directly in front of him, close enough that the tourists couldn't hear. His small chest rose and fell too quickly. He looked up at Thomas with those haunted eyes, and when he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "Sir, can I show you something? But you must promise not to be loud." Every instinct in Thomas's body screamed. This wasn't protocol. This wasn't normal. This was a child asking for help in the only way he knew how. "Of course, Your Highness," Thomas replied, his tone carefully neutral even as his heart began to hammer. Prince George glanced around once more, then slowly, so slowly, lifted the sleeve of his crisp white shirt. Just a few inches. Just enough. The marks were unmistakable. Dark, deliberate, finger-shaped bruises wrapped around the small wrist like a grotesque bracelet. Some were deep purple, fresh. Others had faded to a sickly yellow-green, evidence that this wasn't the first time. Thomas had seen horrors. He'd served in conflict zones, had pulled injured civilians from rubble, had stared down armed insurgents. But nothing had prepared him for this moment. For the sight of violence inscribed on the arm of a child who should have been the safest person in England. Time seemed to stop. The tourists faded into white noise. End of footnote. The palace walls closed in. In 12 years of service, Thomas had never felt fear like this. Chapter 2. Marks no child should know Thomas dropped to one knee. The movement was swift but gentle, bringing his eyes level with the prince's. Otto says, around them, the palace continued its morning routine, oblivious to the earthquake happening in this small pocket of silence. "May I?" Thomas asked, gesturing to the boy's arm. George nodded, tears pooling in his eyes but not yet falling. Thomas gently took the small wrist in his gloved hand, examining the marks with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen too much violence. The bruises formed a clear pattern, 4 fingers on one side, a thumb on the other. An adult's grip. The older marks suggested this had happened at least 3 or 4 times before. Maybe more. "Who did this?" Thomas asked, his voice low and steady despite the rage building in his chest. George's lip trembled. "Someone who works here? I can't say who. They told me if I told anyone, something bad would happen. To me? To my family." The words hit Thomas like physical blows. "Where did this happen?" he continued, each question measured, controlled. "In the locked room, the one near the servants' corridor. They said it was a game at first, but then—" George's voice broke. "Then it hurt, and I wanted to stop, but they wouldn't let me go." A memory flashed through Thomas's mind. Syria, 5 years ago. A little girl hiding in a destroyed building, bruises on her arms, the same terrified eyes. He'd carried her to safety that day, had made sure she got to a doctor, had promised her she'd be okay. He'd kept that promise. He would keep this one, too. "Your Highness," Thomas said, his voice firm but kind, "you did exactly the right thing by telling me. You are very brave." "Do you understand?" "Very brave." George nodded, a single tear escaping down his cheek. Every fiber of Thomas's training told him not to move, to maintain his post, to report through proper channels, to follow the protocol that had been drilled into him through countless hours of instruction. But there was a higher protocol, one written in the most fundamental law of humanity: protect the child. Thomas's mind raced through possibilities. If he left his post, it would cause immediate alarm. If he reported through standard channels, it would take time. Time the prince might not have. Time that could be used to destroy evidence, to threaten the boy further, to make him recant his story. No, this required something else. Thomas's thumb slowly pressed the hidden emergency switch inside his glove. Chapter 3. The alarm that changed everything in the palace's security control room. 3 floors below ground level, a single red light began to pulse on the main monitoring console. "We have a silver shield activation," the duty officer announced, his voice cutting through the ambient hum of surveillance equipment. Every screen in the room seemed to freeze simultaneously. Silver Shield wasn't the code they used for terrorist attacks or security breaches. It was something far more serious. It meant a member of the royal family was in immediate danger from someone inside the palace walls. "Location," the senior commander barked, already moving toward the tactical response station. "East Courtyard. Guard Thomas Hale. He's with Prince George." Camera swiveled silently, zooming in on the scene. To the tourists beyond the gates, nothing appeared unusual, just a guard speaking quietly with the young prince. But to the trained eyes in the control room, everything was wrong. The guard's posture, the prince's body language, the way they were positioned. Get me a lip reader on that conversation, now. Within seconds, a specialist was analyzing the footage from multiple angles. Her face went pale. "Sir, the guard is asking about injuries. The prince is... he's showing his arm. I can't see clearly from this angle, but... Lock down that corridor," the commander interrupted. "Execute Protocol Shepard. Silent deployment. I want plainclothes officers within 30 meters, 0 visible presence. Get Dr. Morrison from the medical wing, discreetly, and someone find me the on-duty schedule for everyone who's had access to that child in the last 2 weeks." The room exploded into controlled chaos. Keyboards clattered, radio chatter filled the air on encrypted channels. But outside, on the palace grounds, everything remained eerily normal. Thomas remained at his post, still speaking quietly with Prince George. To anyone watching, it appeared to be a pleasant conversation between a guard and a curious child. Inside his earpiece, a voice crackled to life. "Guard Hale? Command acknowledges your signal. Maintain visual contact. Help is moving into position. Do not break character." "We're coming to you." Thomas gave the slightest nod. "Your Highness," he said gently, "I'd like you to walk slowly back toward the palace. Not to your room, to the eastern drawing room." "Do you know it?" George nodded. "There's going to be a very nice lady there who helps with the gardens. Her name is Officer Chen, though she doesn't wear a uniform. Can you remember that?" "Officer Chen," George repeated. "So, she's going to ask you about flowers, but what she really wants to do is make sure you're safe. Will you trust her?" Another nod. Thomas watched as a woman in civilian clothes, khaki trousers, a pale blue blouse, a gardener's hat, appeared at the edge of the courtyard, carrying a basket of fresh-cut roses. "Go now," Thomas said softly. "And George?" The prince looked up at him. "You're not in trouble." "You're not going to get in trouble, I promise you that." George walked away on unsteady legs. Officer Chen intercepted him naturally, engaging him in conversation about the roses as she steered him toward safety. In the control room, the duty officer's fingers flew across his keyboard, pulling up access logs, security badge records, surveillance footage from the past month. A pattern was emerging, one that made his blood run cold. "Commander, we have a problem. Badge 7749 has accessed the restricted residential wing 17 times in the past 3 weeks, always during shift changes. always when minimum staff were present. "Who's 7,749? The officer's face went white as he read the screen. Malcolm Renwick, Senior Palace Steward, 27 years of service. Impeccable record. Where is he now? According to the badge log, he's in the administrative wing. But, sir?" The officer's voice dropped. "His last swipe was 18 minutes ago, and he hasn't swiped out. The system shows him as still in the building, but his physical location doesn't match." The commander's jaw clenched. He knows. Someone tipped him off, or he sensed something. Find him. Lock down all exits. Nobody leaves this palace until I personally clear them. Throughout the massive structure, hidden mechanisms engaged. Fire doors locked silently into position. Security gates descended in service corridors. Garden entrances sealed. Every exit, from the grand front gates to the smallest servant's door, became impassable. The palace wasn't under attack from outside. It had been infiltrated from within. Chapter 4. The Man with the Wrong Key. Malcolm Renwick moved through the palace's service corridors with the confidence of someone who'd walked them 1,000 times, which he had. For 22 years he'd been invisible, the perfect servant, the reliable steward, the man who kept things running smoothly behind the gilded scenes. Now he was the perfect ghost. He'd felt it the moment the atmosphere changed. Call it instinct, call it paranoia, call it the sixth sense that all predators develop. Something had shifted in the palace's energy. Radio chatter had gone silent. Guards weren't rotating on their usual schedules. Small changes, subtle ones, but he'd learned to read them. The boy had talked. Renwick's hand tightened around the master key in his pocket, a key he wasn't supposed to have, one he'd copied years ago when he first realized how useful it would be to move through spaces where he shouldn't be able to go. He turned down a dimly lit corridor toward the server room. If he could access the security system, delete the last month of footage from the restricted wing, he might still slip away. Retire early, disappear into the countryside. They'd suspect, but they'd never prove. He pressed his badge against the reader. Nothing happened. He tried again. The light remained red. His heart rate spiked. They'd locked him out, which meant they knew. Which meant he had minutes, maybe seconds. Renwick spun on his heel and headed for the loading dock exit. It was his backup plan, the one he'd mapped out years ago when he'd first started, when he'd first recognized the opportunity that proximity to power provided. The corridor ahead was dark. Too dark. The emergency lights that should have been on were off. "Hello, Malcolm." The voice came from everywhere and nowhere. Renwick froze. The light snapped on, blindingly bright. 6 figures in black tactical gear materialized from doorways and corners, weapons trained on him with surgical precision. Thomas Hale stepped forward, no longer in his ceremonial uniform, but in the dark fatigues of the palace's emergency response team. On your knees, hands behind your head. Do it now. Renwick considered running. His eyes darted to the exits, calculating distances, odds. But the operators had positioned themselves perfectly. There was no angle that wasn't covered, no moment of hesitation to exploit. He dropped to his knees. The takedown was swift and professional. Hands pulled his arms behind his back. Zip ties secured his wrists. Within 10 seconds, Malcolm Renwick went from trusted palace steward to prisoner. "Search him," Thomas ordered, his voice empty of emotion. They found the key first. Then the phone, a burner, unregistered. Then, in his jacket pocket, a small vial of clear liquid. "What is this?" the team leader asked, holding it up. "Propofol," Thomas said, recognizing it immediately. "Sedative, used in surgical procedures." He looked down at Renwick. "Also used to keep children quiet." They found one more item. In Renwick's breast pocket, folded carefully, was a child's drawing. Crude stick figures, a small boy and a tall man. The boy's face drawn with a frown, the man's with a smile. At the bottom, in shaky handwriting, "Please let me go home." Thomas felt something cold settle in his chest. This wasn't opportunistic abuse. It wasn't a moment of weakness or a terrible mistake. This was preparation. Chapter 5. The Truth Behind the Bruises. Dr. Sarah Morrison had served as the palace's chief physician for 15 years, but she'd never been summoned with such urgency. When she entered the private examination room, she found Prince George sitting on the edge of a medical table, Officer Chen standing quietly nearby. "Hello, George," Dr. Morrison said gently. "I understand you've been very brave today. The examination was thorough and heartbreaking. Beyond the wrist bruises, there were marks on the upper arms, defensive wounds on the forearms where George had tried to protect himself, a partially healed contusion on his ribs. The medical report would use clinical terms consistent with non-accidental injury. Pattern suggests repeated trauma. Psychological distress evident. But the truth was simpler and more terrible. Someone had been hurting this child for weeks, maybe months, and had been getting away with it. 3 floors above, in a private study, the king and queen were being briefed. The king's hands gripped the arms of his chair so tightly his knuckles went white. The queen's face had gone completely still, a mask of controlled fury that would have terrified anyone who knew her well. "How long?" the king asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Based on the medical evidence, at least 4 weeks, possibly longer." "And this man Renwick, he is in custody?" "Yes, Your Majesty. The evidence is overwhelming." Beyond the physical evidence and the prince's testimony, we found planning materials. He'd been researching sedatives, studying the prince's schedule, identifying windows of opportunity. "For what purpose?" the queen demanded. The commander hesitated. "We found correspondence on the burner phone, encrypted, but our people broke it within the hour." He was planning a kidnapping. The abuse was a means of control, of conditioning the prince to be compliant, to not call for help. There's discussion of a ransom, of selling information about palace security, of having leverage over the crown. The king stood abruptly, walking to the window. Outside, London carried on, oblivious to the nightmare that had been unfolding in its most famous building. "Who else knew?" he asked. "We're investigating every staffer who had access. But, sir, we don't believe anyone else was directly involved. Renwick operated alone, exploited gaps in our protocols, relied on the assumption that no one would suspect someone with his tenure and record. That ends today," the queen said firmly. "Every protocol will be reviewed. Every staffer will be vetted again. And I want to know how a child was crying for help where none of us heard him." Later that evening, in a secure interrogation room, Thomas Hale stood on the other side of a one-way mirror, watching as investigators questioned Renwick. The man had said nothing, invoking his right to legal counsel, but his eyes told the story. There was no remorse there, only calculation, only the cold assessment of a predator who had been caught but wasn't quite ready to admit defeat. A senior officer approached Thomas. "Guard Hale, you broke protocol today, left your post without proper authorization, initiated emergency procedures on your own judgment, made contact with a member of the royal family outside of prescribed circumstances." Thomas turned to face him, his expression unreadable. "Yes, sir, I did." "The king wants to see you." Thomas expected discipline. Instead, he found himself in the king's private study, standing at attention while 2 of the most powerful people in England looked at him with expressions he couldn't quite read. "At ease, Thomas," the king said quietly. Thomas relaxed marginally, but remained standing. "What you did today," the queen began, her voice thick with emotion she was fighting to control, "was not in the manual, not in any training protocol, not in the established chain of command." "No, Your Majesty, it wasn't." "Why did you do it?" Thomas met her eyes directly. "Because in that moment, I wasn't a guard. I was a man who'd just seen a child in pain, and everything I've ever been taught, everything I've ever believed, told me that protecting that child was more important than protecting tradition." The king nodded slowly. "They'll want to court-martial you, you know. There are those who will say you overstepped, that you should have reported through channels, that you endangered the prince by not following established procedure." "I understand, sir, but they're wrong." The king's voice was firm now. "You saw what needed to be done, and you did it. You chose the child over the ceremony, and because of that choice, my son is safe." Thomas felt something loosen in his chest, something he hadn't realized he'd been holding tight. "Uniforms protect tradition," he said quietly. "Soldiers protect children. The Queen's composure finally broke. A single tear traced down her cheek. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for hearing him when we didn't." Chapter 6, The Medal No One Would See, the official story, released to the press 3 days later, was brief and deliberately vague. A security drill at Buckingham Palace led to the identification of a potential procedural vulnerability. One staff member has been dismissed pending investigation. All protocols have been reviewed and updated. The royal family thanks the security services for their continued diligence. No mention of abuse, no mention of Prince George, no mention of Guard Thomas Hale. The truth was classified at the highest level. Only 17 people knew the full story, and they'd all signed documents ensuring their silence. The case against Malcolm Renwick was proceeding through a private court, away from public scrutiny, away from the media circus that would have destroyed what remained of George's childhood. In the restricted wing where George's rooms were located, every lock had been changed. New cameras had been installed. A rotating team of vetted security officers now maintained constant but discreet surveillance. And most importantly, George had a direct emergency button installed in his room. One that would summon help instantly, no questions asked. 2 weeks after the incident, Thomas was back on duty at his usual post. Same scarlet uniform, same stoic expression, same routine. But everything had changed. He saw children differently now when they visited, paid closer attention to the staff moving through the corridors, noticed more, questioned more, listened more carefully to the things people didn't say. Late one afternoon, as his shift was ending, a small figure approached from the inner courtyard. Prince George walked up to him, accompanied this time by 2 plainclothes officers at a respectful distance. The boy looked better. The haunted look had left his eyes, replaced by something lighter, something that resembled the childhood he deserved. "Hello, Thomas," George said, using his name for the first time. "Your Royal Highness?" Thomas replied, his voice warm despite the formal greeting. George held out a small folded piece of paper. "I made this for you. But you can't show anyone, okay? It's classified." Thomas took it carefully, unfolded it slowly. It was a drawing, rendered in colored pencils with the earnest enthusiasm of a child who'd poured his heart into his work. A guard stood tall and strong, but over his red uniform was drawn a flowing cape, billowing heroically in an imagined wind. His face bore a gentle smile, and clutched safely in the guard's arms was a small figure, a boy with a crown, drawn with a happiness that made Thomas's throat tighten. At the bottom, in careful letters that had clearly taken time to form, Hero Thomas looked up, and for just a moment his professional mask slipped. His eyes glistened. "Thank you, Your Highness," he managed. George stepped closer and lowered his voice. "You saved me. I know everyone says it was just a drill, but I know the truth. You believed me. When I was scared no one would, you believed me." "I'll always believe you," Thomas said quietly. "Always." The prince nodded, satisfied, and walked back toward the palace, flanked by his guardians. Thomas carefully refolded the drawing and tucked it into his inner pocket, close to his heart. There would be no public ceremony, no medal pinned to his chest in front of cameras, no mention in the honors list. But none of that mattered. 3 weeks later, Thomas received a private promotion, transferred to a newly created position within the Royal Protection Service. More pay, more responsibility, more access. The official reason was exemplary service and initiative under challenging circumstances. Those who knew the truth understood what it really meant. The royal family wanted him closer, wanted his vigilance, his judgment, his willingness to see beyond protocol when something more important was at stake. On his first day in the new role, he found an envelope on his desk. Inside was a single card, handwritten in the Queen's elegant script. "The greatest honor is not the one the world sees, but the one that lets a child sleep safely. Thank you for earning both." Months passed. Malcolm Renwick was convicted in a private trial and sentenced to 18 years in prison. The case files were sealed. The palace implemented 73 new security protocols. Many of them focused specifically on protecting the children of the royal family from internal threats. And every night, in a room with fresh locks and an emergency button within easy reach, Prince George went to sleep without fear. Because one guard had chosen to listen. because one man had decided that protecting a child was more important than protecting tradition. Because in the moment that mattered most, Thomas Hale had remembered why he wore the uniform in the first place. The world would never know his name, but one child would sleep without fear because he chose to listen. And in the end, that was the only medal that mattered.